Welcome to the West Coast Conference Bible Study Prep Session for 2017. My name is Rene Chun, and I've had the chance to be a part of the West Coast Conference since I guess it was the mid-1980s. So it's been a while, but it's been really a blessing to be a part of, the opportunity to grow, opportunity to serve. And so I want to thank you for taking the time out to come and be trained in how to study the Bible and how to lead a Bible study for a small group. We have our schedule. What I will try to do is have a mixture of Bible study training segments as well as an introduction to the 3 Bible study passages that we'll have for this coming year. So we'll try to mix the two together and therefore have there'll be kind of the teaching part of how to do the Bible study, but then we'll also see how some of those tools can be applied to those particular passages that we're looking at for this coming year. When you look at the set of passages we have this year, there's the Matthew 16 one, and I think we'll spend the most time on that one because that one I think is the most complicated of the 3. Then there's the Luke 14 passage, which, it has some parts that sound very harsh, and we need to kind of come to grips with what Jesus is saying there. And then the 1 Peter chapter 2 passage is the one that has a lot of the practical, this is what you need to do, this is kind of the attitude we need to have. So that's a quick overview of the 3 passages, and as we go through them, we'll deal with some of the interpretation questions, parts that are a little bit puzzling, and we'll try to go through those. I encourage you to take advantage of additional training opportunities. I know that the West Coast Chinese Christian Conference Alumni Association has a series of training videos that is part of their Bible Study Leader Certification Program, so I would encourage you to take advantage of that if you haven't already. I think where we begin in terms of being a Bible study leader is that it starts with you, starts with us. And I like to remind people, encourage people with the verse from Ezra 7:10, where it says, "For Ezra set his heart to study the law of the Lord, and to practice it, and to teach the statutes and ordinances in Israel." So as you can see, it starts with an individual's heart to study, to actually take a close look at what the Bible has to say, and then to put it into practice, because we don't want to just read the word and walk away. We want to actually try to put it into practice. And so once we've done the study, once we've been the first student, so to speak, of the Bible and put it into practice, then we can go forth and share it with other people. So this year's theme is Follow in His Steps. And there are 3 Bible study passages I mentioned, Matthew 16, Luke 14, and 1 Peter 2. And so just a quick overview in terms of the challenge and how it relates to its theme. The overarching theme is Follow in His Steps. The morning and evening speakers will explore that theme, but you'll also be exploring it in the 3 Bible studies in the mornings. And so the Matthew passage, I think the basic challenge there is, do we know who we're following? Will we lay down ourselves and take up a cross? As far as the Luke 14 passage, that one highlights, is our commitment as disciples more important than anyone or anything? And in the 1 Peter 2 passage, we're looking at, are we living as strangers in this world willing to suffer? So Jesus went through it. He's not asking He's not asking us to do anything that He didn't do. So that, I think, is the challenge from that particular passage. So now some quick just overview thoughts on how do we go about studying the Scriptures. There is a stepwise process that we want to invite the Spirit to work in our hearts to do. There's the part where we observe what the Bible says. We read the Bible, we want to observe what's there. Then we interpret what it means, and then the final step is that we apply it. So I use the metaphor with the wedding cake where you have these individual layers. The biggest layer is observation, where you begin by looking at what is in the text. And then you build on that by interpreting what's there, and then the final part, you actually apply it. And so when we talk about observation, what we're talking about is gathering the facts to lay down a foundation. And once with those facts in hand, we can then do interpretation. And the key to interpretation is determining the meaning of what has been said or what has been written in the light of the context of where it's been presented. And then finally, after you do that, we can apply. And what we're doing there is trying to connect timeless principles to our situation. So that's the personal study part, where we're sitting in our room at a desk with our Bible. We go through that observation, interpretation, application process. And one of the tools that I have found to be very helpful, that many people have found very helpful, is to do a textual analysis. And we'll go through it as an example in the Matthew 16 passage, and in a shorter form in the other two passages as well. And so when you're doing the textual analysis, where you actually kind of go through word by word, phrase by phrase, sentence by sentence, you wind up observing what's there. You wind up interpreting what's there. And then as you do that, you begin to see, okay, God is trying to say something to my life, and we can apply. So the textual analysis part helps you look at the details as well as the connection of the details. The transition to then leading the small group is then you devise questions based on what you've read. And again, as you want to basically lead your group to go through what you went through personally as you were sitting down studying the Bible by yourself. You want to lead the group to observe what's there. You want to lead the group to begin to ask, okay, now what did that actually mean? How do ideas A and B connect? Things like that. And then you then pose some application questions where people can then think about, okay, how should my life be different because I've just read this? So the questions are your bridge to then actually leading the group. And then when you actually lead the group and you pose your questions, hopefully you walk the group through the observation, interpretation, application process. So in some ways, I have in my PowerPoint the picture. The first part of the textual analysis is like you're chopping up the food. The question preparation is you're now cooking it together to begin to prepare a meal. And then the group dynamics part would be actually leading the group, where you're like doing the hospitality, actually presenting the food with the group of people. So in terms of observations, the key thing is, of course, to start by reading a good translation of the Bible. Reread the passage, read it again, read it multiple times. And if you have the opportunity to go ahead, read it maybe in a couple different translations. I'm curious, what are some of the translations that you hear at your church that they use for preaching? Or what is the one that you use typically when you're personally? So I'm always curious. Over the years, I've seen them kind of shift back and forth, so I'm curious to hear what you guys read. NASB and NIV were kind of the ones I usually hear, but I'm hearing ESV coming up a lot. Okay, as you can see from the graphic there, translations do fall in a kind of a continuum, because after all, the original language is Greek, or in the case of the New Testament, or Hebrew in the case of the Old Testament. And whenever you try to translate, you can try to do it word for word, and that's one way of doing it, and that would be one part of the spectrum. The NASB would be one where they really try to do that, very closely. The advantage of the course is that it is kind of word for word. The disadvantage is it can sound a little awkward, because the way Greek or Hebrew, the way they say things, it may not be like the way they say things in English. So sometimes it sounds a little awkward. On the other side of the spectrum is to try to translate thought by thought, which is, most embodied probably the most extreme example would be the Message, where you really try to put it in a very modern, earthy way of saying things. And of course, there are translations to try to thread the middle ground, which the NIV is the one that has tried to hit that middle ground. Okay. So anyway, do take advantage of the fact that there are translations on different parts of the spectrum. In one of the interpretation points that we'll go through today, we'll actually look at 4 different translations and how they translated one particular verse. And you'll see that there are subtle differences. Okay, so observations, what you're doing there is gathering the facts. You're asking questions like who's there, what is being said, when, is there some time references in the passage, where, sometimes there are indications, they went to this particular place, or Jesus is standing, next to the temple, or whatever. You need to know what is happening. Why? Sometimes why things are actually explicitly stated. Sometimes why is we have to kind of infer it. But if it's explicitly stated, then it's an observation. And then how, sometimes there are, kind of, how did certain things happen? How did A lead to B to lead to C? How did that conversation unfold when Jesus is talking to different people? And so these things are usually answered straight out of the text, although sometimes you may need to do reference works to try to figure out what's happening there. And once you go beyond what you can find immediately from a text or from a very quick look at a reference work, if you have to go beyond that, then you're now moving into the realm of interpreting what's happening. But observation is something that usually you could pick up pretty quickly. You could either read it right there, or you just look something up and you can get it. And anyway, as you read, you begin to jot down questions to yourself. If there's a word that's unusual, or a place you don't know about, or some other thing that's not immediately obvious to you, and you jot a question to yourself, those are certainly good questions you could use in a small group Bible study. So after you interpret, after you look at the text and begin to ask all these basic questions about what is actually there, you then proceed to the interpretation process. And the first thing I try to encourage us to do is, before jumping to the question, what does it mean to me, we want to begin to ask, what did it mean to the readers or hearers then? Because after all, the New Testament was written for people who were living in the first century. The Old Testament were written for Jewish folks. So it had a certain meaning to them at that time. And then what we want to do is get a sense for what that might be. We kind of jump into a time machine and try to figure that out. Some things are just the human condition. There's no difference between them and us. But there are times when, there are some peculiarities to the time that it was written or the time that they actually heard it. And so you just want to be cognizant of that. And so to help us do that, we want to be very alert to the context. So context, context, context. It's just like real estate, location, location, location. So in the case of Bible study, you're concerned about the context. And what you want to avoid is, disconnecting it from the context, because a Bible text without a context is a pretext to say anything you want. So you don't want to do that. We want to avoid doing that. And so what kind of context are we talking about? As I already mentioned, the historical, cultural context, that's one aspect, is that it is a particular time and place where these things we're reading about in the Bible happen. They're not happening in California in the 21st century. They're happening in whatever setting in the Middle Near East in the ancient times. Another type of context is what is known as literary context, and I'll expand on that a little bit more. And then there's also biblical context. And I'll go ahead and explain what that is as well. So when we're talking about context of the history and culture, again, sometimes it's just said right there in the text. And other times you will have to look up Bible reference works. So I'll give you an example, like you'll hear about Pharisees, Sadducees, Zealots, and so forth. There were different Jewish sects in the time of Jesus. And so being aware of who these people are, what they think like, those are things that you want to keep in mind. Like if you're reading the Gospels and you have Jesus talking to a Pharisee or Jesus talking to a Sadducee, those are things that we would need to know. Details about the city that Paul is writing to. There are certain things about the city of Corinth. There are certain things about the city of Ephesus. There are certain things about the city of Rome. So some of those details sometimes do matter and help us understand what's going on. Another type of context is the literary context. And what we mean by that is the Bible is not one book, but rather it is 66 books. And there are different types of literary forms. Like there are narratives, basically descriptions of what happened. The Israelites going from here to there, that's narrative. It's the description of what happens. There's poetry, like the Psalms, like Proverbs. Certain segments of the prophets are written in poetic form. There's prophecy, where there's predictions about the future or very strange symbolic language in prophecy. There's, of course, the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. In fact, 2 of the Bible study passages this year are from the Gospels. They're within the Gospels as well as in other books of the Bible. There are parables and other literary devices. There are the epistles. They're the letters from the Apostle Paul, and the letters of Peter, the letters of James, letters of John. These are things of where the apostle is writing to somebody. And one of the passages this year from 1 Peter 2 is an epistle. So each literary form has an implied agreement between the writer and the reader. Just like when you're watching a movie, there are certain conventions when you're watching a action-adventure film. If you're watching a romantic comedy, if you're watching a parody or a satire, I mean, there's certain things that are part of that form of movie. There's certain conventions that go with it. And so the same is true with written literature. And the Bible is composed of these multiple types of literature. A third context to consider is the biblical context. When you're reading, verses 14 to 25, that material is sitting usually with something that was before it or after it. And sometimes that can be very helpful to take a look at what happens before or what happens later. That's a biblical context, the immediate or after material. Within the bodies of the writing of an author. So like, for instance, John, he tends to write with a certain style, use certain terminology. So when you're reading, let's say, a particular set of verses in John, you might look elsewhere and see how he uses those kind of terminology. And so that can sometimes be helpful. The same with Paul. Paul has certain terminology he likes to use, and it kind of crops up in other places where he writes. So that's another type of context that we need to be aware of. And then a third type of biblical context is just the totality of Scripture, because God is the ultimate author behind the Scriptures. And so some of the concepts that appear in one part of the Bible do reappear in other parts. So like the idea of a temple, that gets revisited a number of times. You see it in the Old Testament, you see it in the New Testament, you see it throughout the Bible. And so that kind of overarching theme, which is the biblical context of the totality of Scripture, and that can be sometimes helpful in understanding a particular verse or set of verses, is how it fits together in what God is doing overall. So, like I said, 2 of the passages this year are in the Gospels. And so let's talk a little bit about how the literary context of the Gospels can be helpful to us. So again, as I said, keep in mind the historical situation in the Gospels. At one level, Jesus gives ethical teachings. And these are somewhat timeless. What he said then, I think, the human condition hasn't changed. Human beings are still sinful. So a lot of things he teaches then, are applicable to us now. They're essentially timeless. However, he did live and teach within a particular time and place. So sometimes how he say things will sound a little strange, maybe a little peculiar. It may have to do with the fact that he is talking in a particular time and place. His particular emphasis, why he particularly emphasized certain things, is because of a particular time and place. So that's the history within the context of the Gospels. So for instance, like the Jewish setting of the Gospels, the people in the Jewish community, they were Pharisees who looked at the world a certain way. They were Sadducees who looked at the world a certain way, who had a certain standing in the society. There were Zealots, there were Essenes, there were all these different types of people that he would encounter, and the way he would address them, we would need to take into account how these people looked at the world and how he would talk to them. In a Jewish setting, there are concepts of the temple. I mean, the temple was a big deal to them because during the time of the Gospels, the temple was actually there. I mean, today, the temple doesn't mean anything to us because it got destroyed. So when you go to Jerusalem today, the temple's not there. It has a certain meaning to the Orthodox Jews because they still remember it. But for us, it's pretty abstract. But for the people in the Gospels, it was something that they saw, something they visited, something they really cherished. The Torah. If we think of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the Jews were very big on, Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. The Torah was really big to them. Keeping the Sabbath was really big to them. And there were other things that was very distinct about what it meant to be Jewish. And why Jesus would talk about those things is because that's his audience. They may seem a little remote to us because we don't live in that setting anymore. So when we're reading the Gospels, we need to be aware of those things. And then there's also the whole question of messianic expectations. And that's something, messianic expectations, both incorrect expectations as well as the ones that Jesus then gives to them to correct their incorrect expectations. Another part of the gospel setting is that it is within the Greco-Roman world. The Greeks had dominated culture for many centuries prior to when the Gospels were written. The Romans were in charge at that time, and so there are peculiarities about the Greco-Roman world that we need to be aware of. Another thing to keep in mind is that Jesus is the master teacher, and what he does is he employs many methods, proverbial sayings, similes, metaphors, analogies, question and answers, parables, hyperbole, etc. There are all these different literary devices, these different teaching tools that he uses. There's one way that can be taught, like the 10 Commandments, you just say, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and on down the line. That's one way to teach, but Jesus uses more than that. And each of these has some things that we need to be alert to see how he is trying to make his point. So when you're thinking about those literary devices, think also in, I'm going to use an SAT word here, pericope. It's a technical term for basically an episode within the Gospels, because the Gospels are often composed of little chunks of episodes. Sometimes the chunk could be like 2 verses. Those 2 verses appear both in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, or Matthew, Mark only, or whatever. But the scholars have identified that these little chunks of teaching from Jesus, either chunks of sayings, chunk of teachings, or a particular event like a healing or a particular miracle. And so there are these pericope, these little episodes. And so what you want to do is identify the boundaries of what that episode is, and then ask, well, how does the literary device that Jesus is using fits into that particular pericope to help make the point that Jesus wants to get across? Okay, and so the literary context of the Gospels, there's a big picture of theological context. The whole idea of the kingdom of God, right? Jesus talks about that. The kingdom of God is at hand, or he'll say, thy kingdom come. There are various times he talks about the kingdom. He uses that kind of language. And one of the things that I have found helpful that scholars have suggested that is a way to have a filter to look at, a grid or a parameter to look at what Jesus is saying, is this whole idea that the kingdom of God is on one hand already here, but yet not yet. There's an aspect of it that's here present, but another aspect that is still to come. And so I have in the PowerPoint here a diagram from a particular book that I recommend highly for everybody. It's the book called How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth. And so the copy that I have on page 147, there's this diagram where it shows the idea of how the kingdom has come, it has begun, it's ultimately consummated in some future time point, and how this current age is passing away. So there's this kind of overlapping aspect to the kingdom, that it's kind of arrived, but then it's not fully consummated. And so when Jesus talks about the kingdom, there are sometimes he speaks of it in future terms, but there are other times he speaks of it in present tense terms. And so having this framework can be helpful in understanding some of the things he says that might at first hearing sound a little peculiar. Okay, and so when we're talking about interpretation, I'd like to share the verse Deuteronomy 29:29, where it says, "The secret things belong to the Lord our God, but the things revealed belong to us and to our sons forever, that we may observe all the words of this law." So the Bible has stuff that is very clear for us to understand. And those things are revealed to us, and we should observe those things. But there are some things that we just simply don't know, like what is the relationship between God's sovereignty and man's free will? I mean, the Bible talks about those things, but we're not told how do those two things come together. I mean, that just kind of belongs to God. We don't have to worry our head over that. We just have to acknowledge that that tension exists. Or how does the Trinity work? That God is, there's one God, but there's God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit. It's revealed in the Bible that there is this dimension, this aspect of God, but how it fits together, that's not revealed to us. And so our responsibility is to be honest with what's there, what we can figure out from the Bible. And then there are other things that, it's just what belongs to God, and it'll just blow our mind to try to figure it out. And we shouldn't lose too much sleep over those things. Okay, so one of the tools that is very helpful in Bible study is what we call textual analysis. And so on my PowerPoint here, I have this chunk of text, right? It's just a block of text. It looks very intimidating, right? It says, preparing a textual outline is a process that helps us make observations in a passage, identify the sequence of thoughts, and understand the relationship of ideas, giving us a basis to make interpretations to seek application. As such, it is a helpful tool in organizing a small group Bible study. So that block of text can look very intimidating, but what will help us is if we begin to break it down into its parts. Preparing a textual outline is a process that helps us make observations in a passage, identifying the sequence of thoughts, and understanding the relationship of ideas, giving us a basis to make interpretations, to seek application. As such, it is a helpful tool in organizing a small group Bible study. Okay, so breaking it apart into its words, phrases, and sentences can be helpful. And so when we're doing a textual analysis, when we're looking at a particular chapter of the Bible, a particular set of verses, what are we looking for? We're looking for repeated words and ideas. Sometimes the words will come up multiple times, and that's something to look for. Contrasts, where he'll say one thing and then there's something else that seems very different. Parallel phrases, where something might be said and said again in a slightly different way. Sometimes they're just lists, and so that helps to identify those things. There are times there are elaborations where you'll have a big picture statement and then you'll have some statements that elaborate on the big picture statement. Or sometimes you'll have little statements and then you'll have a summary statement at the end. Shifts in the subject where, sometimes it's one person talking, sometimes it's we, sometimes it's you, sometimes it's they. So when you identify, the shift in subject, that is something we want to note when we're breaking down the text. References to time and place. There are times when that happens, and that oftentimes those could be indicators that there's a slight shift in the subject matter being discussed. And then connecting words like therefore. If you see those kind of connecting words, that there's some kind of relationship between what happened before and what happened next. And so what I would normally do if we had a studio audience is to go ahead and give it a try, and we were going to try to break down Matthew 16, 13 to 28, and just to read the text and actually try to begin to do an outline of that text. And so maybe we could take a brief break from the video for a second. All right, so let's go ahead and tackle Matthew 16, verses 13 to 28. And so what we'll do here is walk through the process of doing the textual analysis of this passage. So I'm using the New International Version on this particular occasion. And so there you have this block of text, and it can be quite intimidating to look at it in total. And so what we want to do is begin to ask a few questions and begin to break down the passage so we can get at the ideas that's there. So one of the things you'll notice that is there are some references to time in this passage. Right, if you take a look here, there's a part that says when Jesus came. And then there's another part in verse 21 where it says from that time on. And so by noticing those time references, you can divide the passages into two parts. So when you're leading the Bible study group, you know that part 1 will be from verses 13 to 20, and then part 2 will be 21 to 28. So that's already a bit of information that you have to help guide you in your study of the Bible study with the group. You can divide into two parts. So let's go take a look at that first part, 13 to 20. So now that big chunk is now a smaller chunk of text that we can look at. And so one of the things you'll notice right away is that there are people talking back and forth. So note who is speaking. So when you read the passage, you can identify, right? Jesus asked his disciples, they replied, he asked a question, Simon Peter answered, and then Jesus replied. So as you're breaking down this first section from verse 13 to 20, you now know you need to talk about each person and what they said. So what is the subject matter being talked about here? So when you look at it, you can see that the first part is Jesus posing the question, who do people say the Son of Man is? And then the subsequent conversation is related to that. And then in verse 17 onward, he has this big statement to Peter. So within this chunk of text, there were two subject matters. Who do people say that I am? And then this back and forth that Jesus has with Peter. So let's take a look at let's break down the conversation even further. So when Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say the Son of Man is?" And the disciples go ahead and reply, and they give several answers. They say, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others, Jeremiah or one of the prophets. Jesus reiterates his question, "Who do you say I am?" And then Simon Peter answers, and he gives a two-part answer. "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." So when you outline the text, you can now see the discrete bits that are there. And you need to begin to answer for ourselves, well, what do these individual pieces mean? So here's where we do encounter some interpretation that we need to do. So when you see this text, we get a location, Caesarea Philippi. So we need to ask ourselves, well, where is this place? Is there something about this place? And so you can pose that question in a group, and some of them might have a study Bible where they could look up a map in the back. Or they might have a study note at the bottom saying something about Caesarea Philippi. You also notice that he had, when Jesus asked the questions, "Who do people say I am?" you notice he actually already says who he is. He says, "Who do people say the Son of Man is?" And so you might ask the group, well, how many times is the word Son of Man used? And they'll take a quick look, and you'll see that it's 3 times. So actually, Jesus already has an answer in his mind, but he's curious to hear what the group has been hearing from other people. And so then they give the answers like John the Baptist, Elijah, Jeremiah. And so you might ask the question, well, why would these people think that Jesus was John the Baptist? Why would they think he's Elijah? Why would they think he's Jeremiah? And then, of course, now you have the big statement from Peter, right? Well, when Peter gives this answer, "You're the Messiah," well, what does he mean by that? Or when he says, "You are the Son of God, living God," what do you mean by that? And so as you break down the text into these discrete parts, they form questions that we need to ask ourselves and to ask our groups to explore. And so, we can go ahead and look up, well, where is Caesarea Philippi? You'll see that it's this town north of the Sea of Galilee. It's about 25 miles north. And from reference works, you'll find out that it's pagan territory. It's a location where there was Canaanite worship of Baal, which is an Old Testament idol god of the Canaanites back then. It's also a location where there was the worship of the Greek god Pan. And it was also a location where there was the Roman worship of Caesar. And so this place is kind of different from the other places that Jesus has been in, right? He's been roaming around in Galilee teaching there. Now he takes them away 25 miles north. And so we don't know for certain why he chose to take them there, but we can kind of speculate. There could be some significance for him choosing to take the disciples away to this location to have this conversation. One possibility is that sometimes it's good to just get away from the normal place to think about things. That's why we go on retreats. But another possibility is that it's kind of like Jesus' way of saying that I'm more than just your Jewish Messiah, but it's also going to be for everybody, because they've now gone to a place that is not very Jewish. And he's getting them to think about Messiah, Son of the living God. And it was more than just their Jewish categories that they're thinking those things. But that, Jesus is actually going to be the Savior for the world, that he is the King of the world, or the kingdom of God, and it will encompass more than just the Jews. So that's a possibility. That's why he went there. So that's something you can discuss with the group. Further interpretation points. Like I said, why might people think that Jesus was John the Baptist or Elijah or Jeremiah? John the Baptist had died in Matthew 14. So why would people think that Jesus is John the Baptist? Well, of course, John the Baptist was kind of like this forerunner of the Messiah. He's kind of an interesting guy. Messiah might be coming. So the idea is that, maybe Jesus is forerunner to some other guy who's the Messiah. Why might they think that he's Elijah? Well, Elijah did a lot of miracles in the Old Testament, and we see that Jesus did a lot of miracles. So, people might think, this is kind of like another guy who's like Elijah. Or why might people think that Jesus was Jeremiah? Well, Jeremiah, kind of pronounced judgment on Jerusalem, on the people. Jesus has made some, pretty strong statements, so people might think, he's kind of like Jeremiah. So the content of Jesus' teaching could lend itself to people thinking that he is one of these individuals or like one of these individuals. And that allows us to give us a sense of, well, who is Jesus as a person? Yeah, he is kind of this can be this very fiery person like John the Baptist. He does miracles like Elijah. And then he does, pronounce some pretty harsh things, like, for instance, against the Pharisees and those people, would be like Jeremiah. But of course, Jesus, he is those things, but obviously he is more than that. And that's where we come to what, Peter says. And so we need to interpret these terms. The name of Jesus itself is Yeshua, which is, YHWH is salvation, Yahweh is salvation. And so Jesus as Savior, that's something we know, that we believe, that we trust in. As I mentioned before, that Son of Man. And what we need to do is go back to Daniel 7, 13 to 14, where it says, "In my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed." So for Jesus to claim the Son of Man title and having the Son of Man as a concept from Daniel 7, it kind of makes sense, right? He talks about the kingdom of heaven is at hand, thy kingdom come, all his kingdom language he's using. He's basically claiming that he's this guy that's described in Daniel 7, 13 to 14. And the vision of Daniel 7 occurs after the imagery of these four beasts and their kingdoms, and how this other kingdom, led by this Son of Man, will then replace them, that will last forever. And so, again, reiterate that the Son of Man terminology appears 3 times in this passage, all of them claimed by Jesus himself. As far as Christ, that term means the anointed one. That is the Hebrew word for Messiah. Christ would be the Greek word for anointed one, and that tracks back to the Hebrew word Messiah. And in the Old Testament, there was the anointing of kings, priests, and prophets. And Jesus is all of those things. He is the king. The Son of Man claim that he makes, he's claiming himself to be a king. And he's a priest. We talk about that in Hebrews, right? He intercedes for us. And of course, he is a prophetic. He goes and speaks for God to the people. So Jesus is an anointed one. He fills the offices of a king, of a priest, and of a prophet. And finally, Peter says he's the Son of the living God. And the idea there is this unique relationship to the Father. Emphasis on living God as opposed to dead gods like Baal, like Pan, or like Augustus Caesar. Okay. So now let's go to the next section, verses 17 to 20, where Jesus has this longer comment to Peter. So Peter had given this answer, you're the Messiah, you're the Son of the living God, and then Jesus replies to him, blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, and so forth. And so let's go ahead and take a look at that and break down the points that Jesus makes when he's talking to Peter. So, blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Then he ordered the disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah. So as you can see, there is a series of points he makes in verses 17, 18, 19, and 20. And so we want to walk our group through each of these points. So we can ask, well, how did Peter know who Jesus was? And we find out that it was revealed to him. It wasn't, he was such a bright guy, but it was revealed by the Father in heaven. Okay. Then there's this comment about the rock, and this has been a source of great interpretive confusion over the centuries. Gates of Hades is an unusual statement. Keys of the kingdom, what do we mean by that? What do we mean by binding and loosing? And why did he tell them not to tell anyone? I mean, we always think, we should proclaim Jesus. Well, he's telling them not to say anything. And so, these are things we need to try to come to understand. So let's go ahead and take a look at some of the particulars here. You are Peter, Petros, and on this rock, Petra, right? He makes that statement. So what we have here is a wordplay by Jesus. He seems to be pointing to Peter as a representative of all who confess and follow Jesus as Messiah and Son of God. So he's not saying that, Peter is a rock, but the real rock and foundation of the church that would be founded is on this confession of Jesus as Messiah and the Son of God. Okay? And so that's one, I think that's the way most of us take it to mean. There are some other options that have been offered, but I think this is the one that makes the most sense. Because it comes on the heels of the confession that Peter makes. And so Jesus is basically making a play on word. You're a rock, and on the rock of this confession, the church is going to be built. Okay, gates of Hades. Hades is, that was the Greek word there. Sheol is the Hebrew word. It's the place of dead people. And so the thought is that gates keep people in or out. I mean, if you close the gates, theoretically people from the outside can't get in, but likewise people inside can't get out. And so the thought is that the ministry of Jesus, culminating in the resurrection, and the proclamation of the church means that the gates of Hades, the gates of death, are breached so that those who are dead are rescued. That's one possibility. The other possibility is that, although all human beings die, those in Christ aren't held behind these gates. So either way, I think it is a viable explanation of what Jesus is getting at. The idea that, he's going to be raised from the dead, and that this message will go forth, and that we will get to share in the resurrection eventually. And so that's the idea that the gates will not prevail against the church. And then there's the phrase, the keys of the kingdom. The idea of keys, we all know there's the authority to unlock doors, and thus a metaphor for authority that is the proclamation of Jesus that the church will carry into the world. And so when the church has the keys of the kingdom, it's this idea that the church has authority because it's proclaiming this message of Jesus to the world, and that can unlock people from their bondage of sin. And then there's the bind in heaven, loose in heaven. My thinking is that, and a lot of people think that it's just continuing this metaphor of authority. So if the keys to the kingdom is like the idea you have keys to unlock doors, the continuing idea of authority that things bound in heaven are going to be loosed in heaven, things are bound on earth are going to be loosed on earth. And so the idea here is that the proclamation of Jesus results in the merging of heaven and earth. We say in our Lord's Prayer, "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven." And so by the proclamation of the work of Jesus, the work of the ministry of the church, this idea that what's happening on earth and what's happening in heaven are going to become together. All right, so now let's continue on to verses 21 to 28. How do we break that part up? And so again, we look at who is talking. So we can see that Jesus began to explain to his disciples, and he says certain things. And then Peter, in verse 22, takes him aside. And then in verse 23, Jesus turned and says to Peter. And then verse 24, Jesus then turns to his disciples and speaks to the whole group. And so again, we have in our hands here a set of things being said by different people, and what we want to do is break down each individual segment on what they're saying. So in verse 21, from that time on, Jesus began to explain. And what did he explain to them? He tells them he must go to Jerusalem. He tells them he must suffer many things at the hands of the elders, chief priests, and teachers of the law, and that he must be killed, and on the third day be raised to life. And so he tells them a mouthful at this point here. And so this is a big turning point in the ministry of Jesus, because he starts talking about dying. Previously, it's the kingdom of God, healing, ethical teachings, and now all of a sudden he's talking about dying, and this is really going to throw the group off, and they will continue to wrestle with this idea for the rest of the Gospels, and they really don't come to terms to it until he actually is dead, and even then they probably still don't quite get it, and then he rises from the dead, and then they get it. So this is a turning point, and it's very difficult for the disciples. And it also indicates that the opposition to Jesus will increase even further. I mean, he's already encountering opposition already, so you can imagine he's already forecasting it's going to get even worse. And so this is a big turning point, and that's why you have this very strong response from Peter, right? Peter takes him aside, and he says, "Never, Lord, this shall never happen to you." And so let's go ahead and break it down. Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. Never, Lord, he said, this shall never happen to you. And then Jesus turns back and equally strongly responds to him, get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns. So as you can see, we have a good application point here. Notice how vehement Peter was, right? Rebuke, and he uses the word never twice. And then Jesus pushes back at Peter's pushback very strongly. Get behind me, Satan. And so I think this is a real lesson in discipleship. I mean, if we're talking about what it means to be a follower of Jesus, what we're really wrestling with is this kind of tug of war between what our will is and what God's will is. And so Jesus tells them, you're concerned about your concerns. You want to be, we'll have this great kingdom and you'll get to be on my right hand and left hand and all that. Well, that's not the plan. There's something else that's going to be happening. And you need to be in line with what my plans are. And so that's really, I think, our struggle day to day is that, God has certain things that he wants to accomplish, and we may have our own concerns, and the tug of war in discipleship is saying, okay, thy will be done, not my will be done. And so this passage, I think, really captures that sentiment. And I think when we're in our small group time, we want to sit in that tension to see that, Peter struggled with that, and we are going to too. And yet Jesus pushed back, and eventually Peter does eventually get it. Okay, then he turns to his disciples and speaks to them. So after he speaks to Peter and deals with his particular issue, now he talks to the disciples. And so again, we want to look at the specific points that Jesus go ahead and make to them, right? Whoever wants to be my disciple is one segment from verses 24 to 26. And then he kind of transitions to the Son of Man language in 27 to 28. So he talks to them, whoever wants to be my disciple. So how does he elaborate on this? So you could break it down. There are essentially 4 statements that come out after he says, whoever wants to be my disciple, and he makes 4 points, must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. Whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will find it. What good will it be for someone to gain the whole world yet forfeit their soul? And what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? And so here the application point is that discipleship equals everything for God, and it's worth it. So let's take a look at it again. Deny themselves, right? I've marked it in white there, underlining it. Take up their cross, follow me, lose their life, give. So we want to give up everything. That's what discipleship involves, these things, denying ourselves, taking up a cross. In the case of a cross, in that time and place, a cross to us is a jewelry item, but in the Near East, in the Roman times, a cross is death, it's pain, it's suffering, it's shame. You get paraded in public for people to jeer at you. And so the call to take up a cross is quite striking. And it would really stick to them as being, oh my goodness, did we sign on for this? So that's what it is about giving up their lives, giving everything. But it's worth it, right? If we lose our life and give it to Jesus, we'll find it because he's the one who has life. He'll give it to us back. He'll give us new life. He'll give us an eternal living with a relationship with God. We can give all of this and we get our soul back because Jesus is our Savior. He'll save us, body, soul, and spirit. Our whole life is going to be given back to us as we give ourselves to Him. And so then we come to verses 27 and 28 where it says, for the Son of Man is going to come in His Father's glory with His angels, and then He will reward each person according to what they have done. Truly I tell you, some who are standing here will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in His kingdom. And so this is an interesting and peculiar statement from Jesus, and you break it out into its constituent parts. There's one aspect that sounds future, right? Verse 27, right? Coming in glory with His angels, and then He'll reward each person according to what they have done. So that part sounds future. But then there's this peculiar part in verse 28. Truly I tell you, some of you who are standing here will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in His kingdom. That one sounds like it's kind of soon because, people only live, today we might live to be 70, 80 years old. Back in those days, okay, maybe 50, 60 years. But the idea is that this is pretty soon. So how can both be true? One is this future thing and one is this kind of soon thing. Does this mean Jesus is coming back within their lifetime? So that's kind of the mystery, and this is an interpretation point, and it's great mystery to, we do ask, this sounds very strange. And so here's where I think it's helpful to think about that already and not yet concept, this broader vision of what God seems to be doing. Because when we read this passage about coming of his kingdom, we often think about this part at the end that's in the future, when Jesus comes back in the future. And so when you see that, you think, well, the disciples, it's been 2,000 years. They're obviously long dead. How can it be? And so some people have criticized the Gospels because they're saying, oh, Jesus makes this prediction. Well, it was wrong. The disciples are long dead. He still doesn't come back. And so that's why people sometimes will question what Jesus has to say. But if you look at it from this already not yet concept, you'll see that the Son of Man coming in his kingdom has happened at the cross and the resurrection. And so in that sense, the kingdom has already come, and the disciples are still alive to see this. Truly I tell you, you will not have tasted death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. The resurrection is soon to occur after his death, and then 3 days later he resurrects, he ascends, the Spirit comes, Pentecost. Some things have been set in motion. The kingdom of God has begun, and this age is passing away. So the Son of Man has come into his kingdom and has begun. It hasn't been consummated yet, but it has begun, and thus the disciples are still alive indeed to see this. And this is because we think of the kingdom of God as already here, but then not yet fully consummated. Okay, so go ahead and summarizing what we've covered here. In Matthew 16, 13 to 28, what we're looking at is a conversation about who is Jesus. Right? In verses 13 and 15 is what other people say, and then what the Father revealed to Peter in verses 16 and 17. There's this segment about the church, how it's built on the rock of confessing who Jesus is in verse 18, and how death will not overcome that church in verse 18, and how there's authority given to the church in verse 19. And then he transitions to this conversation about what true discipleship is. Jesus tells them that suffering and resurrection is around the corner. Peter's selfishness is rebuked. And then Jesus explicitly tells them to deny yourself, take up your cross. And he says it in several different ways in verses 24 and 26. And then it concludes with how the Son of Man and the glory of God and the kingdom are in verses 27 and 28. Okay, so some of the application points you can get from here is, well, do we know Jesus? When we're here at the conference Bible study, some people might not have made the commitment to Christ yet, so we want to encourage people to consider the claims of Christ. And even for ourselves as followers of Jesus, we continually need to weigh into who Jesus is and weigh into what he teaches, and do we actually do what he's teaching? Another application point is that there's this element of the community of faith, right? Does our community of faith, our church, proclaim Jesus? And are we committed to this local family of faith? And then the application point about discipleship, placing God's agenda before our own. That's that whole back and forth between Jesus and Peter. Peter had his own concerns, but Jesus telling him, no, you need to have the concerns of God. That's the main tension between God's will and my will. But I think at another level, we can experience this tension in terms of taking into account the needs of others instead of automatically being concerned of our own well-being. So not only do we want to kind of make ourselves a little smaller in light of our relationship with God, but also in our relationship with one another, that we don't automatically want to seek our own self-interest in our relationship with other people. Okay, so those are some of the application points I think we can get from this particular passage. So to kind of come back around, the context of this passage in Matthew 16 is this transitional moment in Jesus' ministry, where he takes them to Caesarea Philippi, kind of takes them outside of their usual space and place, and then he begins to talk about things that they hadn't heard before, talking about death and resurrection. The content, the claims of kingship in the whole Son of Man conversation, the keys to the kingdom, talking about death and resurrection, and then, of course, the very strong words about discipleship. And so, of course, then the challenge then is, well, do we know who we're following? Do we recognize Jesus as who he is? And do we trust him and follow him? will we lay down ourselves and take up a cross? Okay, so those are the quick summary for that particular passage, and then why don't we go ahead and take a break, and then we'll pick up the day 2 passage. Okay, welcome back. Let's go on to day 2. We're going to look at Luke 14, 25 to 35. So here's the text again. You see a large block of text. And so the way we'll go ahead and approach it, we won't go to the same level of detail as we did with the Matthew one, but I did the Matthew one so you could experience what it's like to break it down to its finer parts. So we won't do that to the same level of detail here. So what we want to do first is, because this is just Jesus talking, and so what we want to do is identify the different teaching points that Jesus makes here. And so let's take a look at it here. It says, large crowds were traveling with Jesus, and then turning them, he said, and so you can see they're readily identifiable blocks of things that he says. So like the first block, he says, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even his own life, even their own life, such a person cannot be my disciple. And whoever does not carry their cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. So that's one block. The next block is, suppose one of you wants to build a tower. Won't you first sit down and estimate the cost to see if you have enough money to complete it? For if you lay the foundation and are not able to finish it, everyone who sees it will ridicule you, saying, this person began to build and wasn't able to finish. So that chunk is about this metaphor involving the building of a tower. The third one is another metaphor, in this case, in verse 31, or suppose a king is about to go to war against another king. Won't he first sit down and consider whether he's able with 10,000 men to oppose the one coming against him with 20,000? If he's not able, he will send a delegation while the other is still a long way off and will ask for terms of peace. Then the next one is kind of a summary of what has gone on before. In the same way, those of you who do not give up everything, if you do not give up everything you have, cannot be my disciples. And then the summary of the whole area, of the whole section, is then verse 34, salt is good, but if it loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is fit neither for the soil nor for the manure pile, it is thrown out. Whoever has ears to hear, let them hear. So here are the 5 things within this particular passage. The part about whoever comes to me but doesn't hate, various relationships described there, building a tower, about going to war, and in verse 33, giving up everything, and then a summary statement, salt is good. So do some of the teaching points have something in common? So when you look at this list of things, you can see that this middle section is about resources, right? The guy who is building a tower, he has to sit down and count up, does he have enough resources to build a tower? The guy counting up about the war has to see, well, do I have enough soldiers to engage in this battle? So there's this section about resources that we don't want to lose, because you obviously don't want to build a tower you can't finish, because it's a waste. You spend all this money and this tower is there unfinished. It's a waste of resources and it's an embarrassment. People laugh at you, say, oh, you built only half a tower. Or if you go to war, you wind up losing your soldiers and you lose the war. So again, that's about resources that you don't want to lose. So the discipleship teaching that Jesus is making is that the priority of following him is greater than relationships in verses 25 to 27 over anyone, and over the resources, over anything in verses 28 to 33. And then he summarizes in 34 to 35. So let's take a look. If anyone comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even their own life, such a person cannot be my disciple. I think one of the questions we can pose to the group is, how do people react to this verse? Because I think it does sound pretty hard on the ears. I mean, it seems so extreme. And so that's something that I think when we lead our small group Bible studies, we want people to wrestle with that, to feel the tension that's there when you read something like this. Because Jesus sometimes says things that are very hard sayings of Jesus, and this is certainly one of them. And so what you want to do is have people identify that it's there, wrestle with how it feels, and then begin to address, well, how do we deal with it? So as I mentioned earlier, when we talk about interpreting the Gospels, we want to be aware of him being a master teacher. He employs many methods. I mean, he could just go ahead and say something like in the Ten Commandments, do this, do that, do this. But there are other ways that he can communicate his point. And so what we see here is one of these methods. And in this case, what we're seeing is the literary device of hyperbole. We experience hyperbole if you watch any of these sports movies. One of kind of cliche moments in the sporting movie is when the basketball coach or the football coach or some coach kind of fires up the people and he tells them, I want you to kill those guys and get the rebound. Guard them so close that you stick to them like glue. Get out on a fast break and run circles around them. When he's saying those things, none of these things are literal. These are all very imaginative, hyperbolic ways of saying things to make a point. He wants them to play with some urgency. That's the point he's trying to make. That's what the basketball coach is trying to do. And so when Jesus makes this statement, we don't take him literally and say, oh, now I'm going to have to go hate all these people in my life. It's not what he's doing. It's hyperbole. What he's doing is he's using a particular device of teaching within this particular set of teachings. So within the context of this pericope, within the context of this episode, this is an episode on discipleship. This is not an episode on explaining the meaning of honor your father and mother or love your neighbor. Because if Jesus is going to teach about honor your father or mother or teach about loving your neighbor, he won't say it this way. Instead, what he's trying to make a point about discipleship is that we are to follow him far and above anyone else. I mean, we do want to honor our father and mother. We want to love your wife. I mean, in Paul, he teaches that. We want to love our children. We want to love our fellow brothers and sisters. But here he's saying, in comparison, our love for God will be so much greater. The priority of loving God is far and above any other human relationship we have. And so that's a struggle, obviously, in certain parts of the world where Christianity is more persecuted, where these kind of things can happen, where families can be divided. Maybe less so here in the United States, but certainly it can happen that people have, the relationships could become severed because of one's Christian commitment. You can almost imagine a scenario where maybe a parent might want their child to become, a doctor, lawyer, whatever, but then because of their Christian commitment, they've chosen to go to the missions field or to choose to work at a nonprofit organization or something. And there could then be a tension between their relationship with their father and mother over their choice of what they believe God is asking them to do. And in that situation, one's commitment to the Lord is greater than one's commitment to the relationship to the father and mother. And so that's where this teaching would find its application. Okay. Now, then there's the set of imagery involving a tower, involving a war, involving salt. And again, you're looking for common elements when you're looking at metaphors or similes or these kind of teaching devices. You don't want to get too hung up in the details. You don't want to get tied up in, what about 10,000 guys or 20,000 guys? That's not really the point. What you want to see is what are some of the common ideas, what's the point he's trying to make, and you can see that the thing in common between the tower and the war scenario is that this guy has to sit down and consider. He has to think about, how much is it going to cost me to do this? And so that's what's in common here. The idea that there's a task at hand and that there's resources involved. And in the case of the tower and the war, you don't want to lose your resources, because if you lose your resources, you're in trouble. And so that's what's in common here. So in the literary device of simile, metaphors, and analogies, don't get hung up on the details. The 10,000 and 20,000 men is kind of secondary. It's just the idea that the other guy has more than the king who's doing the considering. So don't get hung up on details. What you want to do is identify the key concepts behind the metaphor. In this case of the tower and war metaphors, one does not want to lose one's resources. Hence, you want to count the cost. Now then, Jesus goes ahead and makes a statement after the two metaphors are given. There are two parallel metaphors about the tower and the war, and then he makes a statement. But as a disciple of Jesus, we do count the cost, and in this case, the metaphor is flipped on its head. He tells them basically, you have to be willing to let go of your resources to follow him. So in the previous one, when there's resources at hand, the natural thing to do is to count the costs and not risk your resources, not lose your money, not lose your reputation. But as a follower of Jesus, we're to count the cost, but in this case, it's the willingness to let go of those resources, to place God as higher than the resources. And so here the metaphor gets turned on its head. So those of you who do not give up everything you have cannot be disciples. The natural thinking in the tower and war metaphor is, don't do it. It's too costly, don't do it. Jesus is basically telling them, count the cost and be willing to let go of the resources you have, because I'm higher than your resources. You can trust me. So to summarize this passage here, true discipleship involves, a priority over all of our relationships in verses 25 and 27, priority over all our resources in 28 and 33, and then he finishes off this section by giving this parable of the salt about discipleship. The parallel is that's the discipleship, the metaphor for discipleship in 34 and 35. And this idea is that the salt is good. If you're a disciple and you're actually doing it, that's a good thing. But then if the salt doesn't live up to its function, then it's a waste. And so that's the challenge for us, is to go ahead and be those true disciples, to be that good salt that actually has an impact, that actually is flavorful, that has preservative effects, that flavors food and so forth. So the good salt has fulfills its function. And so the application points you get from this passage would be to ask ourselves, how much does self-pleasure, self-protection, and self-interest guide our decision-making? Because that's the natural way to do things. Our survival instincts are very strong. We like to be happy. We like to be safe. We like to have what our plans are happen the next day. And so the challenge of discipleship is to be able to say, well, maybe it isn't so important that I'm always happy and that everything is going good for me. That, there are times when it is worth risking something, to risk some danger or to risk some resources or to risk some embarrassment or whatever it is that we kind of hang on to get our sense of protection, our sense of self-worth, to be able to say, well, maybe I can let that go for God's sake, for what God wants to accomplish. And so we need to ask ourselves and challenge ourselves to get beyond our own self-interest, which is kind of a thought we already had in our Matthew 16 passage in the previous day. And taking up a cross is essentially laying down self. In that world, that meant actually literally dying and suffering and taking on the shame that a cross would entail. And so taking up a cross is laying aside the self. Other application points we can dwell on, of course, is that a big chunk of this teaching is about resources, the tower and war metaphors there. So the question we could ask ourselves, well, how tightly do we hold on to our resources? How real is it in our heart that we are to be grateful stewards and managers of the resources God has given us? Everything you and I have, it's been given by God. And in a sense, we may think we own it, but it's really been just given to us. And so our attitude should be, okay, I'm grateful for what I have. How can it be put to use for God's work? And some of God's work is to provide for our needs through the resources he's given to us. So if we have the opportunity to be employed or to have the opportunity to go to school, we should be grateful for that opportunity, because that's something God has given to us for our benefit. And so we want to take a look at our resources and be grateful for what we have and be willing to let them go if necessary. And that's what the challenge is from this passage. Okay, so taking a look at Luke 14 in summary fashion, the context is, Jesus has been attracting large crowds, and people are very attracted to the show, quote unquote, the show. Miracles, healings, interesting teachings. Sometimes when he has these little dialogues with the Pharisees and he kind of puts them in their place, the crowd gets attracted to that. There's a bit of a show to it. But, Jesus is recognizing that, are these people really ready to follow? And so that's the context of this teaching. And he turns to them and then gives that teaching, where you do hear some hard sayings, things that are very hard on the ears, that just sound like almost like scratching chalkboard. But Jesus is making a point. He's using these metaphors, he's using these hard sayings that get across one clear message, that the priority is the Lord, to follow him. And so the challenge for us then is to simply ask ourselves, well, not so simply, simple to ask but not so easy to do, is to ask as disciples, is our commitment as disciples more important than anyone or anything? Any other human relationship that we have, even our own life, if it comes down to it, are we even willing to give up our lives? Certainly when you think of the early believers, when the persecution came, would they, follow Jesus? They did, and they gave up their lives. And there are places in the world today where that happens. Or even when the plague came and people were dying of disease, it was often the Christians who would care for people at the risk of their own lives, because they felt that was just more important, is that they would obey loving your neighbor even at the risk of their own lives. Remember the stories of how the Ebola outbreak in Africa a few years back, some of the work that was being done were by Christian doctors, and they risked their lives to do that. And there was a story of how a couple of them actually got the Ebola virus, and they flew back to the United States to treat them. And so again, they felt that the work that they were doing for the Lord, for these people, was more important than even their own physical well-being. And so that's really the challenge from this kind of passage is following Jesus more important than any relationship, more important than anything else, even more important than our own lives? Okay, so that takes us through the Luke 12, or Luke 12 passage? Yeah, Luke 14 passage. And so let's go talk a little bit about group dynamics. I know we're just kind of talking rather quickly to go through the passages, so really the goal here is to kind of help us understand what the passage is about. But when you have your group of people, with your 8 or 12 people or however many people you have, you're asking them questions, you're giving them encouragement, and what you're trying to do is two things. You want to encourage participation because you don't want to just lecture like I am doing now. You want people to chime in and share their thoughts, to answer the questions, to look at the Bible and to scratch their head and say, I don't get this, or I think I understand this, and to share their thoughts. But you also are working within certain time limits, because you do want to finish the Bible study in the allotted time, and you want to actually go through all the verses that are there. So you're balancing encouraging participation with maintaining control over the study. And so if using an XY axis, you want to have, if you in position number 1 in the graph, where you have low participation and low control, that's not good. I mean, it's just chaos. I mean, that's not a good thing. Number 2 setting is where you have encouraging a lot of participation, but you have no control. That's not good either, because then people are just going all over the place. People are saying things, but they may not be related to what you want to talk about. Situation number 3 is low participation but high control. I mean, when you're in a lecture situation, that's where you want to be. You want to, because you're trying to go through certain material. Let's say if it's a group of 500 people, then yeah, the amount of participation is going to be much more constrained, and you want to maintain more control. In a small group Bible study with 8 to 12 people, you want to be in position 4, where you're maintaining control, covering the material in a timely fashion, but you're also encouraging participation. So that's your goal in your group dynamics, is to maintain control and to encourage participation. And so what you want to do is go ahead and pace the discussion. You want to start and finish on time. I don't know, these days the Bible studies are 45 minutes, 50 minutes? I don't know what it is. It's probably that's the range it's been in the past. I don't presume that's the case now. So yeah, make a note for yourself, how long the time you have. On day 1, of course, you want to have some time for brief introductions, because the group doesn't know each other. So you want to allocate on day 1 a little bit of time for that. In day 2 and 3, you have a little less of that. You want to open with prayer. You want to close with prayer, and you can do group prayer if time allows. And then you want to plan out your discussion to cover the whole study. So in your question set, so you'll write out your list of questions, your 8 to 12 questions or however many you have, and you might want to mark off that, I want to get to verse such and such by the halfway point. Because, as you do the textual analysis, you can identify the clear demarcations. Verses so-and-so to so-and-so is the first idea. Those other verses are the second idea. So you want to maybe mark off, I want to be, about half of our time will be on the first part and half on the second part. And you could make a note on your questions that, I need to get to this point by such and such a time. Okay, so then you go ahead and direct the discussion. You put out the questions, so you gear the discussions toward the objectives for each Bible study. And you want to avoid tangential matters, That often happens that people go off on tangents, and you may let it go for a minute or so, but you want to bring them back. Go ahead and utilize your questions to guide you in that process. Think about transitions to direct the discussion. So like when you're moving from one section to another, you want to think of ways to move that along. Though you want to encourage participation, you do need to keep an eye on the clock and move things along. So you might want to have an actual watch, because sometimes I think, handling a phone for the time, you have to push a button to get it to light up, or you might drop the phone, but having a watch can be very handy for that. Okay, so balancing the encouraging of participation and maintaining control. Some of the tools you can have to do that aside from your questions, because questions is using your verbal part, but there's also nonverbal cues. So, want to encourage quiet group members in a group of 8 to 12. If you've done any of those Briggs-Meyer tests, some people are more introvert and some more extrovert. So you do want to encourage the quiet group members. And what you can do is just look at them, give them a smile, and they may then chime in and share what they're thinking. You might encourage the group to respond and question each other. So you might say, if somebody says something, you might ask somebody who's a little bit quieter. You might say, what do you think about Allison's idea? Or you might specifically call on somebody and say, how would you answer Bob's question? Complement insightful answers to encourage participation. What happens if somebody gives an answer that's just out in left field? What you can do is, initially you want to avoid directly telling them they're wrong, because then people will become discouraged to speak up. People will then become too shy. So what you want to try to do is then ask what other people think about it. So if somebody poses an idea, you might say, what do you all think about that answer? By drawing in the rest of the group. So you might ask, what meaning might this verse have? What other meaning it might have? What are some of the options of what verse 10 means? And you might get several different answers. You might just ask, who else has an opinion about this? Give hints at some point. If, let's say, nobody has gotten anywhere near the answer yet, then you might begin to give hints to what the answer might be. You might play detective with the group by saying, what do you mean by that? What steps lead you to that conclusion? One good question is saying, let's look at the passage again, or have the group reread aloud again the verse where you think the answer is. So those are ways to get the group back on track. Now, another challenge that sometimes come up in a Bible study group is that our more exuberant participants speak very freely and at greater length. So you want to prevent monopoly, because once one person starts talking a long time, then everybody who will start to clam up. And so we want to try to avoid that. So one way to do that is to hint to that individual that they've gone on a little too long by looking elsewhere. Because, oftentimes when we talk to people, if they're looking at you or you're looking at them, the conversation continues. And if you look away, then the cue is given that maybe it's time to wrap up that thought. You might at some point need to interrupt and say, thanks for sharing. Let's hear what the rest of the group thinks. So that would be a way to kind of redirect the group to encourage someone else to participate. You might notice in looking at the group that somebody is kind of on their edge of their seat to chime in. And then you might actually go ahead and call out to them and say, Christina looks like she has some thoughts on that. Okay? Or you might ask, let's take a poll and go all around and get a response from all the group members. Okay, and then of course, certainly if this it continues to be a problem, then you would talk to that individual afterward to encourage them that, thanks for sharing, but we want to encourage everybody else to participate as well. And hopefully that will help them recognize that they can make their points and move along. So those are all things you want to do to encourage participation from some of the quieter members, to maintain control on the individuals who might be a little bit more vocal. And so you use these devices, both nonverbal and verbal, to accomplish this. So let's go ahead and take a look at the day 3 passage, and we'll take a quick look at that. 1 Peter chapter 2, 11 to 25. So let's take a quick look. This one is written by the Apostle Peter. So let's go ahead and take a look at the timeline of his life. So we think that the ministry of Jesus was probably around AD 30 to 33. It all depends on when you think the crucifixion occurs, because I think some people think the crucifixion occurred at AD 30. But the idea is that it's around this time that the 12 disciples followed Jesus around, of which Peter was one of them, and probably the most famous of the group. In the book of Acts, which covers the years AD 33 to 51, we see Peter highlighted a great deal in Acts chapters 1 through 12. We see him also in chapter 15. But from 13 and onward, then the story shifts somewhat to the Apostle Paul. But we know that Peter was very active in the church in those years, in those chapters in the book of Acts. We find out from church history that he did go on to Rome, and he not exactly sure when, but that was part of his life, probably outside of the book of Acts, where Luke starts following Paul in his journeys. And at some point, probably Peter moved to Rome to do the ministry there. The thinking is that 1 Peter, what we're going to be studying in day 3, was written around the early AD 60, because the Roman persecution of Christians began to be more severe in AD 64 to 68. And in 2 Peter, persecution seems to be talked about much more explicitly, whereas in 1 Peter, the persecution seems more remote, because there's even parts where he talks about honoring the emperor. So there isn't quite the fear of the emperor at that time in 1 Peter. So that's why the thinking is that it's a little bit earlier. And then church history indicates that Peter died in AD 67, I guess the legend is that he was crucified upside down in Rome. So that's Peter's life. And 1 Peter, the thinking is that it's the early 60s. And so a little bit more background information about 1 Peter. Who are the readers? Probably mostly Gentiles, as if Peter is in Rome, then that world is a little bit more Gentile. Although when you read 1 Peter, there are still some Jewish flavor in it, but the feeling is that it's probably mostly Gentiles. What were some of the challenges they were facing in 1 Peter's time for his readers? There's some opposition to faith. You can see hints of that, but it doesn't appear to be outright government persecution, because there is this section about obeying the authorities in verses 13 to 17 in chapter 2. So when it was written, as I mentioned earlier, in the early 60s, prior to the Roman persecution of 64 to 68. Where was the sender and readers located? The readers were probably located in modern-day central Turkey. That's the hint we get from chapter 1, verse 1. And Peter was in Rome. That we get the hint from that in chapter 5, verse 13, that's probably where he is. Why was the issues that he was talking about important? He's trying to encourage them in practical living in chapter 2 and increase their knowledge and commitment. And how does Peter address it? Well, throughout the book of Peter, there's a mixture of theology and challenge in chapters 1 and 2, and then mostly daily living in chapters 3 to 5. And as I said, there's some challenge here already in chapter 2. The theology is beginning to take a little bit more of a back seat, and there's more of the practical teaching. But there is definitely theological points there in the passages we're looking at. It's kind of sitting on that transition point. Paul often has theology at the beginning of his letter and then the very practical stuff in the second half of the letter. The same is true in Peter, and we're kind of sitting in that chapter that's kind of beginning to be the bridge between those two sections of the theological part and the daily living part. So let's go take a look. So in terms of interpretation, we did talk about guidelines for interpreting Gospels. Here we'll go ahead and talk about interpretation of epistles in the literary context of the epistles. In the case of epistles, what you want to do is think paragraphs. Never just read a Bible verse by itself. There's idea development and trains of thought. I mean, certainly that's very clear when you read the Apostle Paul. He's very detailed in producing an idea or a train of thought. And that's true of Peter as well as any of the other epistles. There's usually a train of thought, an idea development that's taking place. They're written for a specific group of people or to an individual, often with some problem they're facing. And this is what is known as task theology. So like when Paul is writing to Timothy, there are certain problems in the churches that he's running into. So Paul is doing task theology with Timothy. He's writing to that person in dealing with the situation that he's facing. Or in case like the Corinthians, they had certain problems, and Paul was trying to address the problems that they were facing. Now, in some cases, we don't know what the problem is, and we can only infer it because we have one side of the phone conversation. When we're reading the epistles, we're really kind of listening in on a phone conversation where we only hear one side. And so we can try to infer what might be happening at the church that he's writing to. So when you read the epistles, some things are going to be directly applicable to us. There are certain direct commands that were true for those folks then and is true for us now. There's certain attitudes that are being highlighted and commended that will be true for them and it will be true for us now. But there are other times when some things have, cultural and situational peculiarities. Here in the Peter passage, we talk about emperors, we talk about slaves. Those things don't exist in the same way they do today. So we have to then be aware of what it was like then and then try to draw some principles about what it would be like for us now. So let's go ahead and take a look at 1 Peter chapter 2, 11 through 25. And so you go ahead and read the text. And again, you see, kind of an intimidating mountain of text there. And what you do is want to try to get at the details that are there. And so we can start off by looking for what the big ideas are in this chapter. And so when you take a look, you can see that the beginning part is, "Dear friends, I urge you as foreigners and exiles to abstain from sinful desires which wage war against your soul. Live such good lives." And then he goes ahead and talks about what this life looks like. There are various commands, various attitudes that Peter is trying to encourage and exhort in his readers. Then in verse 21, you have this other idea. "To this you were called because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps." So what had happened was that in verses 11 through 20, there are all these practical advice about daily life. And then toward the end of it, Peter tells them that, if you live this good life, it's possible that you're going to wind up suffering for it. People might misunderstand you, persecute you, or whatever. And so then he transitions in verses 21 to 25 to say, well, this is how we face up to this suffering. And he uses Christ's example of how he faced the suffering to help guide the readers how to live. So let's go ahead and take a look at the big ideas of daily life in verses 11 to 20 and the calling to suffering in verses 21 to 25. So within the daily life section, 11 to 20, you get these kind of statements where Peter kind of gives us a sense of identity. In verses 11 to 15, he kind of starts off with this idea of foreigners and exiles. In verses 16 to 17, he starts off with this idea of, you live as free people. And then in 18 to 20, he talks about slaves. So perhaps a certain percentage of his readership at the church that they were at, maybe a large group of them were slaves and they had that identity. And so within each section, and when you lead your Bible study group, you'll want to walk the group through each section. So you'll tackle 11 to 15 as a group. You'll tackle 16 to 17 as a group. You tackle 18 and 20 as a group. And so within that foreigner and exile section, you talk about, abstaining from sinful desires. What does that mean? Live good lives. What does that mean? What does it mean to submit yourselves to authority? Doing good, things like that. How one practically can do that. Thinking of situations in our lives where we could do that. In that section in 16 and 17, we talk about living as free people. It talks about, don't use your freedom as a cover-up for evil. What does that mean? What does it mean to live life as God's slaves? How can we in our day-to-day life respect everyone? Can we share examples how we have loved the family of believers? What does it mean to fear God? And what does it mean to honor the emperor? In the case we don't have emperors today, so think of the application for us today. We can think of scenarios where there are people who are in authority that we would want to honor. And then in verses 18 to 20, he talks about how the slaves would submit to their masters and how they would bear up under difficulties. And so again, we could find maybe a situation in our lives where we're under someone else's authority who may not always, treat us as kindly as we'd like. And so maybe we could apply verses 18 to 20 in those kind of situations. Then there's this other part in 21 to 25, right? As I mentioned, that you live this good life, you try your best to live this good life. Some people will wind up persecuting you or making things difficult for us, and so there's suffering. And then Peter tells us, well, how do we bear up against that? And so he starts off by saying that Christ's example that you should follow in his steps, and that's verses 21 to 23. And what did Christ do? Or in this case, in mostly, what he didn't do. He didn't commit any sin. He didn't have any deceit when he talked to people. He always just told the truth. He was always honest with people. He didn't try to wiggle his way out. He just told the truth. No deceit. He didn't retaliate. He didn't make threats. And positively, he entrusted himself to God. So then in verse 24, we hear there's a little theological section about how he bore our sins. And then in verse 25, we hear a little bit about his identity, Jesus' identity as our shepherd and overseer of our souls. And so verses 24 and 25 are theological points, but if we grab onto the truth of verses 24 and 25, those things will help us in bearing up under the suffering. So what you want to do is, we've very quickly gone through this passage, and what you want to do is then go ahead and prepare a mixture of questions from what you've read. So, questions are who, what, when, where, why, and how. And what you want to do is formulate questions that fall into one of three categories. There are observation questions, where you're getting people, where we're trying to get people to look at the passage to find the answer. Like saying, well, what does verse 11 say? Or how are we described in verse 11, for example? Then there are interpretation questions where you need to draw conclusions from parts of the passage or from outside the passage. Like how does this relate to something else? What does this mean? Where you have to pull out information from elsewhere. And then application questions are where we are asking ourselves to think about how does this actually connect to our real life situation. So using you have this textual outline where you broke up the passage into the big ideas and into the subpoints. The textual outline is then your guide to preparing your questions. You then want to evaluate your questions. Are they too easy? Though having easy questions can help the group get started talking. Like if, at the beginning when people are kind of shy and kind of don't know each other, you might want to start with an easy question to get people started because I can handle that, they'll answer, and then people will speak up. So don't always shy away from the easy questions, but, obviously don't rely exclusively on them. On the other hand, you don't want it to be too difficult because, that could confuse people or intimidate folks. Though nonetheless, we shouldn't underestimate the group. A deep question can get people thinking and get people talking to share about what they think is going on in the passage. And then, of course, you don't want questions that are too complicated, very long-winded questions. If you ask that kind of question, they'll then ask you, what was the question again? So you want to avoid questions that are too complicated. There are yes-no rhetorical type questions. As a general rule, we want to avoid them because when you ask them, they'll just say yes, or they'll just say no, and that doesn't foster discussion. However, there are times when we do use them because we might use those kind of questions as a transition to the next part, or maybe to summarize a point. And really, that's a rhetorical question. You're posing a question, which is really kind of a statement, a summary statement. So there are places for it, but you don't want to use them as a general rule because they don't foster discussion. You want people to have to answer in sentences, not yes or no. So the questions that you write is your roadmap. You want to mark time points on your questions. You say, okay, I'd like to get to this part by the 30th minute or something, or I want to get to this part by the end. You want to then go ahead and identify items that you want to be sure to cover, because there are some things that are the main points that you want to cover. There are some things that, sometimes they're kind of interesting to discuss, but you don't necessarily have to spend a lot of time on them. So you want to identify the key ideas that you want to be sure that you cover. And then you can then make also a note that, okay,
these things we can go through more quickly. Like if you find yourself running out of time, then you can kind of skip over some things. So identify the things that are, more important, and some things that are maybe a little bit of details that are just fleshing out that you could kind of skip over, or verbally kind of summarize those parts. So when we take a look at the passage here, like I said, verses 11 to 20 is one section, and so I broke it down in this fashion here. And so what you can do is just basically use this structure here in this outline and formulate questions from them. So you might start off the group by asking an overarching question by saying, what is the overall mood of this passage? And when you read it, you say, oh yeah, there are a lot of commands here. It's very practical. You get that sense. It isn't as like some of the hard sayings that we saw in the second study. This one is more, kind of bullet points from Peter. You might ask them about verse 11. How are believers described in verse 11? And then how does this relate to verses 9 and 10, the stuff that came on just beforehand? And then you will ask things like, what are the commands given in verses 11 to 20? So there are quite a few of them. And so what you do is the group might chime and mention a few of them. You may not necessarily have to recite all of the commands that are identified, but you might ask the group, oh, okay, what are the commands? And they'll say, oh yeah, in verse such and such, there's this command. In verse such and such, there's this command. And so then you quickly reveal to the group there are quite a few commands. And then you could then say, okay, why don't we go take it section by section? And we could look at verses 11 to 15 and say, well, what does the command in verse 11 mean? And let's see. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at the first question about verse 11. How are the believers described, and how does this relate to verses 9 and 10? So here's an interpretation point here. The idea of literary context of epistles is that you want to think paragraphs, never read a Bible verse by itself. You want to see the idea development train of thought. And so you sometimes want to have people look at the verses just before the passage. So in 1 Peter 2, the beginning part, you have that kind of unusual phrasing. I mean, we don't usually talk in these terms of, in verse 11, all right, let's see, I'm in 2 Peter here. 1 Peter 2:11, where it says, dear friends, I urge you as aliens and strangers in this world. I mean, we normally don't talk that way, so that's a little bit unusual, and we want to spend a little time and think about that. And we also think about it in light of verses 9 and 10, where we also have some identity teaching. But you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. Once you were not a people, but now you are a people of God. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. So there you have this identity of us as chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession. If we have this standing, what are we in the world? We then become strangers and aliens, foreigners and strangers, right? So there's this kind of division that, if we have this identity with God, that does kind of put us in a strange place relative to the world. And so that's the context that we're in this passage in 11 to 20. Well, how do we live? If we're a holy nation, a royal priesthood, and at the same time that makes us strangers in this world, well, how do we live? And so that's what we get in the following verses. And so we go ahead and say, and Peter starts us off by saying, as aliens and strangers in the world, I'm reading from the NIV, to obtain from sinful desires which wage war against your souls. I think in the NIV it's pretty straightforward what that means, but if people in the group have different translations, they might, if somebody reads verse 11 and they look at their Bible and say, oh, this looks a little different. So let's take a look. Here I have the NIV, the ESV, the NASB, and the NLT side by side. So in the NIV it says, dear friends, I urge you as foreigners and exiles to abstain from sinful desires which wage war against your souls. In the English Standard Version, it goes on and says, to abstain from the passions of the flesh which wage war against your souls. And in the NASB it says, abstain from fleshly lusts which wage war against your souls. And in the New Living Translation, it says, to keep away from worldly desires that wage war against your souls. So as you can see, the wage war against your souls part is all pretty much the same, but it's that other part. In NLT, it's worldly desires. In NASB, it's fleshly lusts. In English Standard Version is passions of the flesh, and in NIV it's sinful desires. So depending on which translation you have, you might have a slightly different angle to what's going on there. And so here's where you have to go back. You get a hint from the original Greek language. The key word there is sarkikos or sarx, which is flesh. Literally, one meaning of this is flesh, a physical body. And you get that feeling a little bit more from the New American Standard Bible. You could translate it that way, kind of that fleshly lust, how our bodies have this kind of, desires. But that word also has a metaphorical meaning, the meaning of the nature of self in opposition to God. And you get that feeling more from the NIV, where it says sinful desires, or from the New Living Translation, worldly desires. And so when this word is used in the New Testament, you kind of have to tell from the context whether we're talking about this kind of literally fleshly thing, or we're talking about this metaphorical, our nature in opposition to God. And so within the context of this passage, right, in verses 9 and 10, we had talked about how we're a holy nation, royal priesthood, and so forth. It sets up this identity that we have with God. And then it transitions to saying that because of this identity with God, we become strangers and foreigners in this world. And so it seems to be pitting this idea that, there's this part of us that's wanting to be obedient to God, but then we're living in this world where there's this part of us that kind of wants to follow ourself, to oppose God, to follow the way of the world. And so literally, NASB and ESV is probably more accurate in using this idea of flesh in a very literal sense, but in terms of the meaning seems to be more the metaphorical sense. The opposition to God, the world in opposition to God, the self in opposition to God. And that's where, I mentioned earlier about that spectrum of translation, kind of the word for word versus thought for thought. ESV and NASB are closer to the word for word thinking. And then the NIV and NLT will be more kind of the thought for thought. And here, the interpretation, and a translation does involve some interpretation because they're choosing which way to go with the words choices here. And I think in this case, the metaphorical meaning seems to be in play here. Okay, so then you want to go ahead and explore what life is like when we want to try to follow God as opposed to follow the world, follow God as opposed to follow the self. And it talks about how we're going to do good deeds. You might reference back to Matthew 5:16 and how we're light of the world, and want to do good deeds that people will then give glory to the Father in heaven. We talk about submission again. In the world, in our own self, it's always we want to be on top, we want to be in charge. The idea of submitting to other people is just so alien to us. So as believers who want to follow God, we don't follow the way of the world, and we don't necessarily have to demand that we be in charge and that there's place for us to submit. The idea of submitting to authority is obviously shown here in 1 Peter 2. Paul gives similar teaching to that effect in Romans 13, that authorities are given by God and we should obey them. Now, there are circumstances when we will refuse to submit, and that's when the authority is in conflict with God. And we could bring up Acts chapter 2, 18 to 20, where, Peter says, hey, we can't stop preaching because we need to obey God. I mean, God wants us to preach, and you're telling us not to do that. And so that will be an example where we don't submit because now it's in conflict with the commands of God. And you pose the question, what happens when we live this way? Certainly some people will recognize that God is at work and give glory to God. There's this part about how let's see, what was that verse here? The day of visitation, I think was the verse I'm looking for here. Okay, so then another question you could ask is, what is the meaning of verse 12? And let's go ahead and read verse 12. Live such good life among pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. And so that's an interesting way of phrasing it. And I think, though, you can have the group try to wrestle with it a little bit and then maybe point them to Matthew 5:16, where it talks about how, if we do our good deeds, they'll then recognize the Father and give glory to the Father in heaven. So
The idea that if people respond positively, it's a day of visitation. It's a positive thing. Now, later on in the passage, there are negative responses to doing the good deeds, like if you look at verse 20. But how is it to your credit if you receive a beating for doing wrong and endure it? But if you suffer for doing good and you endure it, that's commendable before God. So it's possible that doing good can result in suffering, and that's the kind of the negative one. So as you can see in the PowerPoint, you basically turn the textual outline into questions where you then examine the meaning of each phrase, explore what it means. You might need to refer to other parts of the Bible to explain some things. Like the whole submission part, at one level is the idea that if we're following God and His values and not following the world's values, because the world's value is always about I'm number one, I have to be in charge, I have to be in control, the idea of submission is very difficult. But as believers in the Lord and following God's ways, submitting is more palatable. In fact, it's commended. And the idea of submitting to governmental authorities that we see here in 1 Peter 2 is also explored also in Romans 13. So Paul has the similar revelation from God about this point of submitting to authority just as Peter had that revelation from God. Now, there are circumstances where we don't submit to authorities, and you could cite the example of Acts chapter 2, 18 to 20, where the authorities were telling Peter and his teams not to speak for the Lord, not to preach the gospel. And there he says, well, we have to follow God, not men. So the result of this kind of lifestyle, as I mentioned, it could be a positive response, as we saw in verse 12, or it could also result in suffering. These are opportunities for sharing, situations, about what we could do, share about scenarios we face in our lives. You could take a look at the PowerPoint. There are some other sample questions that you could use and certain other verses that you could bring up. Like, for instance, the part about slavery in 18 to 20. I don't know if the people in your group will question, why is there slavery in the Bible and stuff like that. The short answer, of course, is that the way we could apply it today is that there are circumstances where we're under somebody else's authority, like when we're at school or like when we're at work, and the principle there is generally to obey. And it's interesting that the Bible does talk about advice to the masters. So if you look at Ephesians 6:9 and Colossians 4:1, Paul gives instructions for how masters should treat their slaves. And so there's definitely in Paul's teaching no room for abusing the slaves, which is what happened in the American Civil War situation. That kind of slavery was not the kind of slavery that was happening generally in the biblical times. And certainly those who are Christian masters, if they followed Ephesians 6:9 and Colossians 4:1, there would be absolutely no room for that kind of behavior. Okay, and so that takes us through this section here. Now let's go look at the second half. So if that daily life part in 11 to 20, a lot of practical advice, advice on how to maintain proper attitudes, and then that transition to suffering and how one deals with that, we are then called to suffer in verses 21 to 25, and we get to see Christ's example of how he faced up to that suffering. And we're encouraged to follow in his steps, especially in this particular way. And how he faced the suffering was that he committed no sin. No deceit was found in his mouth. He didn't retaliate. He didn't make any threats. Instead, he simply trusted himself to God. And so we have the example from Jesus of how we should face up to suffering. And, that's obviously challenging because our normal response is that if you hit me, I hit back. And that's not how Jesus approached it. In more day-to-day life, it could be as simple as not always demanding that I have the last word in an argument. And this is one thing I was listening to a podcast from Dallas Willard, where he would have these very vigorous conversations with unbelievers. He was a noted Christian philosopher at USC, and he was also an apologetics person. So he was very good at responding to people's questions. And his approach was, you don't always have to have the last word. You could always say, I'll let you have the last word. And I don't have to feel that I have to always have the last word. And so that could be one way we could manifest this kind of behavior, this Christ-like gentleness. Now, we then see that in verse 24 and 25, some theological points about how Jesus bore our sins. So again, that helps us face up to our suffering, because our biggest problem was that we were sinners separated from God. And Jesus has addressed that, and we see that in verse 24. So if we know this deep down in our being, then we can face up to the physical suffering or any social ostracism or any kind of difficulties. It's because our really big problem has already been solved by Jesus and what he's done on the cross. And then in verse 25, we're told that Jesus is the overseer and shepherd of our souls. So he's going to take care of us. You know, he's the good shepherd, and therefore we can face up to any of the difficulties we might encounter. So you turn this section into questions. You just simply ask, well, how is Christ described in verses 21 to 23, for example? You can ask an application question like, well, what unjust situations have we experienced or do we face? You want to get the kind of the thinking questions about what blessings did we gain from Christ in verse 24, and how does this help us bear up to suffering in life? So I kind of told you what the connection is between the theology of verse 24 and the reality of our suffering. What we can do in the group is pose it to the group and say, well, how does the truth of verse 24 help us? And then the group can fill in the blanks. You could do the same thing with verse 25. All right, there's a theological point in verse 25, and the way we could pose it to the group is, how does this help us bear up to the suffering in this life? Since the passage in 1 Peter 2 is the third and final Bible study passage, and if time allows, you might give the group an opportunity to kind of share their thoughts from the week. And so you could kind of finish off the Bible study by asking, can you share any insights or fresh encouragements you got from this passage or day one or day two about what it means to follow in his steps. So go ahead and take advantage of the opportunity, if time allows, to let the group share their feelings from the week that they've been together. So application questions from these things here is, what should we do, sharing about the situations we face and how we could support and encourage each other. So to summarize, the context of the 1 Peter 2 passage is that, we're a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, and that makes us foreigners and exiles in this world. And because of this, there are practical daily life commands that Peter gives us. And then he concludes by giving us the resources to face that suffering. The example of Christ, the truth that he has borne our sins, the truth that he is the shepherd and overseer of our souls. So that content helps us. And so the challenge then is, well, are we living as strangers in this world willing to suffer? Okay. So let's go ahead and go to talk about applications as part of the Bible study. We know from 2 Timothy 3:16 to 17 that all Scripture is inspired by God and profitable for teaching, for reproof, for correction, for training in righteousness, so that the man of God may be adequate, equipped for every good work. So we have the Bible in our hands not exclusively to give us knowledge. It does give us knowledge. It gives us understanding. It gives us a way to look at things. It teaches us about Jesus. But there's a purpose for it. It's to teach us, it's to reprove us, to correct us, to train us to live in a proper way so that we can do good work. And so just as I had the wedding cake picture before about observation, interpretation, and application, in the realm of applications, there's, again, a kind of a sequence there, that there's values that are very foundational. And that's what God is trying to change in us, as our values. And then we have attitudes within our minds, and it manifests ultimately in behaviors in the way we live our lives. So when we're talking about values, for instance, knowing who Jesus is and deciding to follow him is a change in values. It changes the fundamental outlook we have on life, right? Matthew 16, you do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns. Instead, what we're supposed to do is deny ourselves and take up the cross and follow him. This is a change in values. This becomes foundational, and that everything else becomes viewed through this filter. Or like in Luke, where he tells us our value system, that following Jesus is more important than father, mother, wife, children, brothers and sisters, even our own lives. It's more important than our stuff, than our resources, our possessions. We're asked to give them all up, be willing to give them up so that we can be his disciples. So again, we're talking about changing our value system and what's important. Following Jesus is more important than
any human relationship more important than any possessions. Attitudes. Examples here, like as foreigner and exiles, right? If our attitude, our mindset is, okay, we don't really, we live in this world, but we really don't fit in this world. That's a change in the way we look at stuff. In a given day, we encounter a dozen different things, and we can then begin to filter out in our attitudes, okay, that's kind of a worldly way of looking at stuff. That's kind of really a selfish way of looking at stuff. You can kind of begin to see that there are certain ways that the world goes about things, and no, that's not the way I should be going about it. So for instance, an example would be how we can submit for the Lord's sake to every human authority. Because if God is the ultimate authority, then our submitting to some human authority, well, as long as it's consistent with what God's doing, then I don't have to have it my way all the time. In reverent fear, submit yourselves to your masters, to those who are in authority of us. Don't use our freedom as a cover-up for evil. So our attitude is that, yeah, we're forgiven of our sins. And, and what Peter is telling you, don't get to the attitude where, oh, because I'm forgiven of my sins, I can go ahead and do anything I want because God's going to forgive me anyway. That would be the wrong attitude. And so Peter is telling him, don't use your freedom as a cover-up for doing evil. So that would be an example of how our attitudes have to be in line with what Scripture is telling us. And then finally, we're talking about behaviors. These are very specific things that we do, specific things that we say. So live, in 1 Peter 2, for example, it says, live such good lives that people may see your good deeds. Show proper respect to everyone. And a way we often reveal respect is how we speak to folks. Love the family of believers. Well, how do we demonstrate we love people? It's shown in deeds. It's shown in words of kindness, in words of encouragement. And so this is tangible examples of how our behavior is to be changed by our following of Jesus. Christ suffered for us, leaving us an example, and that is that there are things that Jesus didn't do as a response to suffering. And likewise, it did involve things that he did do. He entrusted himself to God. So those would be some examples of behavioral changes that God wants to have us take place. So when we're talking about applications, we're talking about changes, changing our value system, which is very foundational, changing our attitudes, which is kind of how we look at stuff, changing behaviors, which would be very specific things we say and do. So if you want to get some additional training beyond what we've had here, go ahead and check out the Alumni Association webpage. Go ahead and click on the Bible Study Leader Certification tab, and that would be a great place. If you haven't had the opportunity to do that, you should go ahead and take advantage of that. And then just go ahead and summarize my top 10 list. It reveals my age. There once was a time when that was a big thing in the, what was that guy, that show? That late night talk show host, he always had that top 10 list, David Letterman. So anyway, we'll have our top 10 list here. Pray that the Spirit will give you a humble heart and a thoughtful mind as you prepare and lead. After all, the Spirit is the Spirit of truth, and that's the one whom we will call upon to guide us. Observe what is in the text by reading the text carefully. Thou shalt do a textual analysis of the passage, because I think that's a great practical tool to help us, turn what can be a wall of words into identifiable words, phrases, and sentences and paragraphs. Number 7, interpret the Bible, the biblical material in light of its context. Number 6, read the Bible passage again. 5, prepare questions for the group that need more than a yes or no answer. Number 4, don't jump to the application right away, because you want to have the group understand what's going on as a foundation for how we should live. Number 3, use the tools of group dynamics to keep the group on track. Right? You want balance, encourage participation with maintaining control. That's the tools of group dynamics. Number 2, did we say you should read the Bible passage again yet? And number 1, stick to the text and pray that the Spirit speaks to the group through the text. Okay, well, thank you all for participating. Thank you for wading through this time of training. If you have questions, feel free to write me at my email address. And
yeah, just have a great time, enjoy the conference, and we'll certainly be praying for everybody to learn from God's Word and be challenged. All right, thanks.